All right. I'm here with the legend, Scott Horton. What's going on, my man?
I don't know, man. What's up? Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, I want to. All right. So I've been like a total bum about this whole Ukraine situation. So I wanted to get you on here and just explain what's been going on the last couple of months because we hit a point with this whole situation where the US government is just funneling so much money into Ukraine that I don't know, I've kind of lost my will to even follow the subject. It's just I don't even know how to explain it. It's just so disheartening and so degrading and just grating on me in general that if I follow it, I'm just completely and utterly obsessed and depressed and upset all the time. So I actually have not listened to anything about Ukraine in a couple of months. So I just wanted to have you on, give the listeners kind of a, the whole rundown of what's been going on, because I know you've been talking to the right people and getting all the information out there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I will plead guilty to you a little bit that I'm mostly caught up writing a history book. So, I mean, part of that is I have to keep updating it because things keep happening. So the book does cover the war itself and current updates. So, I'm trying to do a bit of that, but people really need to look at antiwar.com and read Kyle and Dave DeCamp on a regular basis, Kyle Anzalone and Dave DeCamp, to really be up to date on every last thing every day. But I can tell you that essentially the news is that last September, Ukraine made some major gains in Kharkiv and I guess the very northern part of Luhansk in far eastern Ukraine, as well as down near Kherson, which is essentially northwest of the Crimean Peninsula, moving toward Odessa there. Sorry, I just had to. And then that was essentially, as far as I could tell, Tommy, the high point of Ukraine's effort to push the Russians out. The idea was, even back then, that they were going to have a big winter offensive to try to cut, if you're familiar with the battle map at all, the Russians have claimed to have annexed these 4 eastern provinces, and they control, this is not accurate, but something like half of all 4 of them. You know what I mean? They don't control all the territory of those 4 provinces, but they swear to one day kind of thing.
Yeah.
But importantly, they do control a, unbroken territory, what they all call the land bridge there, from the southern Donetsk province and then east across the Sea of Azov. So if you think about the territory between the Crimean Peninsula and Russia there, the rest of Russia, I should say, that's the coast of Azov there, the Sea of Azov. And that's where the city of Mariupol is in southern Donetsk. And then it's the so-called land bridge is connecting southern Donetsk and Crimea and, reliberating their fresh water sources, which the Ukrainian government had cut off. And so the idea of the big offensive was to try to sever that so-called land bridge and march all the way to the Sea of Azov. Now, if they had succeeded in doing that, if they do succeed in doing that, then they're surrounded on all sides and are probably doomed to get their army lost in there anyway. Seems like a bad strategy anyway, but that's what they said they wanted to do. But here's the thing. We had a real mild winter, and they have a real problem with mud. I mean, much, not all, but much of Ukraine is the steppe, which is essentially plains. And so in the fall and winter, from all the rains, it's just, feet deep mud. So it's just impossible to use armored vehicles in any real way out there, except on the major roads, which means you got to fight your way through every town and all that kind of thing. So we wanted to wait till the ground froze solid, but it never did. We had a very mild winter over there. And so the ground never did freeze solid in the winter. So the winter offensive became the spring offensive. But then we had a very rainy spring. And so the mud was just war prohibitive. And so the Russians spent that time digging trenches and putting up dragon's teeth obstacles and razor wire and minefields and the rest. to defend the territory that they've already taken, while the Ukrainians were building up an offensive force to attempt to strike. And finally, then, at the beginning of June, basically, the end of the spring, the ground finally dried out in the summer enough where then they could launch their offensive. And it's already failed. I mean, they launched it, I guess, in the middle of June, late June. And they basically just got blown to bits. I mean, they seized a few tiny villages, but essentially they did not come anywhere near breaking Russian lines. I think the New York Times said that they got 5 miles in on a 60-mile journey and had to turn back. And I think it's the 48th and the 33rd divisions or 37th that they just got torn to shreds. And they had some, and these were like the guys who were the best equipped with German tanks, and I'm not sure what all. I know Bradley armored personnel carriers from the Americans. I don't know if they had any M1s or not. I guess they had M1s, but not. Or no, they don't have American tanks yet. They have German tanks and American Bradley armored personnel carriers, basically, and then other what I guess it was British and German mine clearing vehicles. And then what happened was they just didn't do a thorough enough job clearing those mines, and they got caught out there, and they just got chewed up. As Daniel Davis, the former lieutenant colonel, the Afghan war whistleblower, said on the show, they sent their very best, highest, most highly trained and best equipped forces to lead the armored push into the Russian lines. And he said it was just like sending them straight into a bone saw or a buzz saw. He said they just got completely chewed up, destroyed. Those divisions are gone. And so then, there's some pieces in the Times, the Post, and the Journal saying, well, guess we're slowing down, meaning they've already lost. The offensive is over. They say that they're probing Russian lines for weaknesses, but come on, they know where the weaknesses are. That's where they tried to charge, but it didn't work. It wasn't weak enough. They got just essentially caught out there in the minefields. And you probably saw some of the pictures of just destroyed Bradleys out there in a field and that kind of thing, all wrecked. So that was from some of that. In fact, there's a war correspondent named David Axe who writes for Forbes. He used to write for War on the Rocks and I forget what else, but he writes for Forbes, and he had a piece where he just details which divisions and which companies have how many, APCs of which design and whatever. He has all the details there, and he just shows how, they already lost 20% of everything. And so, Danny Davis's point of view is that, look, so this was the bet. Oh, and I'm sorry to finish that one thought. The Post and the Times or whatever, they're complaining. They're saying, I can't believe they're quitting already just because of the high casualties, man. This sucks. And they're, want the Ukrainians to continue to push anyway, even though they've already lost. And I think it's the Journal story that says that they're all just on foot now. They were told to get out of their APCs and go on foot because any armored vehicle is an easier target for Russian drones or artillery or whichever it is. And so everybody just go on foot, and we'll just try to, army crawl to the lines and see if we can get down in the enemy ditches and clear them out with, boots and machine guns and bayonets, I guess, which is just, I think will prove to be completely impossible for them to do.
Yeah.
Seymour Hersh quoted an expert, told him that at this rate, it'll take them 144 years to kick the Russians out of the territory they've already seized. And of course, the Russians are building up, more and more all the time. They have fresh troops all the time. And then to pick up that other broken thought was the whole time the Ukrainians were preparing their offensive, they were not preparing to defend the territory that they still hold. They were building up this offensive force that the Russians successfully defended from. So Danny says, that is, again, Lieutenant Colonel Davis, says that once the offensive here is completely broken and done, then there will be a Russian counteroffensive. And at that point, the Ukrainians will be toast because they have not been building up the defensive fortifications necessary. And they'll be, in a much more weakened and spent state. And essentially the Russians at that point will then probably be able to take back the city of Kharkiv, and then could even go as far as Odessa. And so same story a year later, they should deal now before it's too late. And, I think I forget when it was they lost Odessa. It could be, I think Odessa, I mean, pardon me, not Odessa, Kharkiv. I believe they lost last spring and then they won it back last summer. So now the question is, are they going to lose it again? And Danny Davis is saying, look, the question always has been just how much territory are they going to lose, not whether they're going to push the Russians all the way out or not. So the idea is probably it'd be a better idea to go ahead and go to the table now and negotiate losing as much territory as they've already lost without hopefully having to lose Kharkiv as well and possibly Odessa. And if they lose Odessa, that's a major gain for Russia, I guess. Although they'll have a hell of an insurgency there. There's massive underground catacombs and everything. So I'm sure it'll be an ugly fight for the city. But once they take it, then the Russians will totally have the Ukrainians screwed. Then they'll be completely cut off from the coast.
Yep.
And so, you know, let's you and him fight, you know, when, you know, the you is already bloody and messed up and weak and losing. You know, in fact, give me 1 sec here because I think I have right here, don't I? Yeah. Here's the New York Times says, senior U.S. officials in recent weeks had privately expressed frustration that some Ukrainian commanders, exasperated at the slow pace of the initial assault and fearing increased casualties among their ranks, had reverted to old habits, decades of Soviet-style training in artillery barrages, rather than sticking with the Western tactics and pressing harder to breach the Russian defensive. So, in other words, the Americans taught them all this combined arms, you know, guys on foot, guys in tanks, some helicopters, some artillery, and combined maneuver and this and that fancy stuff. Well, that wasn't working. They got their asses completely handed to them. So now they're going, well, let's just fire artillery. And the Americans are going, damn it, we want you to push. Even though, as Davis said, it's a buzzsaw. You want them to push into what?
Right.
To gain what? The Americans claim that somehow they've been claiming for months that they're going to get the Ukrainians in a position of strength. And then that way they can force the Russians to deal on terms that are more favorable to Ukraine. So one, they admit that Ukraine can't win and force Russia out, and they know it. The question is a matter of degrees of strength before we come to the table. And then I have to say, man, that I just know this from my lifetime covering this, that never works. And in fact, if you look at when they tripled the war in Afghanistan in 2009 through 12, David Petraeus swore to Barack Obama that, look, if you give me the 70,000 troops I need, I will have the Taliban on their knees, licking my hand, signing my terms by July 2011. Just give me my troops. And of course, July 2011 came and went, and Petraeus quit and went and got a job at the CIA so he could try to rewrite the history of the war over there, which didn't work. That's why the CIA overthrew him, in fact, and turned him into the FBI for spilling secrets to his whorebag mistress. But anyway, they're not in a position of strength. They're not improving the Ukrainians' position so that they can force Putin to bow down to their wishes. They're losing. And you know,
well, I mean, it's pretty obvious too. Like if you're sending if your best troops are getting eaten up by a bunch of mercenaries, then you know you're in trouble when Russia actually unleashes their best troops on your country.
Yeah. Well, in fact, so that's a reference to the battle for Bakhmut, which I left out of my narrative there. I should have mentioned that. Starting in August of last year, the Russians launched an attempt to take this city of Bakhmut, and they finally did succeed in doing that at the end of May. And, you know, right before they turned around and launched this offensive. But as you say, that was mercenary forces. That was not regular Russian forces that took Bakhmut. So now the war party spin in the West was, see how weak and pathetic the Russians are. They have to free all these prisoners and send them as this mercenary army to go and fight in Bakhmut. Well, Daniel Davis was like, no, that's not how you spin this at all. Here's what's going on there. The Russian army is kicking back. The Russian army is resting, recuperating, rearming, and they're digging trenches and laying mines and preparing dragon's teeth and razor wire to get ready for the coming offensive that, again, they've been bragging about for 9 months, saying it's about to commence.
Right.
So, meanwhile, what are they doing? They're simply and merely expending mercenary forces conscripted out of the prisons to go and take this city. So, meanwhile, Kiev's troops, their best troops, were getting ground up, fighting against the Wagner forces there for Bakhmut. And then by the end, the whole damn city's destroyed. It's not worth nothing anyway. If you owned it, you'd have to bring a bulldozer and just start the whole damn town all over again. There's nothing left. Well, I don't know, nothing left, but major portions of it have been just absolutely decimated.
Yeah.
So some prize. But the point is that the Ukrainians are saying, no, see, we're so smart. In fact, the Americans told the newspapers, geez, we don't think this is a good idea, honestly, but they're not listening to us. Zelensky, they said, had it in his head that him and his national security team, that what they want to do is they were killing so many more Russians than Ukrainians were dying in Bakhmut. They said that they wanted to just keep going. It's a meat grinder, but it's hurting them more than it's hurting us, the Ukrainians said. But again, they're only fighting conscripts, and they're spending their best troops, and then ended up losing anyway. And in this massive war, and there's so much coverage of poor and uneducated and old and unequipped and ill-trained Ukrainians being just conscripted and sent straight to the front after a week or two. Some of them had, this is all mainstream coverage that you can find, where some of them had no experience firing a rifle at all, no experience how to throw a grenade, no idea really what to do at all, and just sent to the front and just chewed up. And then they lost anyway, and they really gained nothing from it.
Well, and they're having to, you made a comment earlier that they're having to abandon the armored vehicles and these personnel carriers. And I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, okay, so if I remember when I was in the military, the way these vehicles were set up and was to carry like 4 to 6 people, maybe 8 at the most. They weren't made to carry a ton of people. And so your average soldier is carrying about 80 to 100 pounds on their back. Like that's what they'll carry in a ruck march, right? If you're rucking, you're carrying about 80 to 100 pounds. Let's even go on the high side. Some guys like your M60 machine gunners may carry up to 120 pounds worth of equipment, right? So if you multiply that by 8, I'm looking at it, you're like 800, 960 pounds, right? Under 1,000 pounds. These armored vehicles are carrying well over 2,000 pounds worth of equipment. So you're already like losing a significant amount of equipment that you have access to when you go on foot, as opposed to going into an armored vehicle and into an armored assault. So you're already on your back foot at that point. And so you're putting these guys in a situation where the Russians have already trenched in, they've already gotten all their equipment to that front line, and they're going in insignificant as far as equipment goes. And it doesn't mean that there's not special forces like Navy SEALs or Green Berets or some people like that aren't trained to accommodate that type of battle. But are we really going to consider the Ukrainian forces up to that standard?
Yeah, I mean, no. And they're desperate, they're
I mean, they were recruiting 50 and 60-year-olds into their military.
Sure.
Like a year ago.
And I don't know this for sure, but they at least said, Tommy, that, well, we're saving our best troops for the big offensive. We're sending the 60-year-olds to go get ground up in Bakhmut while we're stalling for time, waiting for the ground to dry out so we can do our big offensive and all that. So presumably these are their best troops that they've been training in Germany and holding in reserve this whole time. And then, yeah, they've already lost. And, I think it's in the Times story. And it may have been the Journal. Yeah, I think it was the Journal piece. that has the guy saying, we hit a landmine in our Bradley and we were all right. It shook the hell out of us and everything, but we were okay. I guess Iraqis, IEDs, were a little bit more powerful. These Russian mines, it was like, yeah, man, you don't want to run over one in your Bradley, but if you do, this guy was, had lived to tell about it. Him and his buddies had lived to tell about it. But now we're sending them crawling on their bellies. You can go find a mine by having it blow you to little bits,
Right. You and the
armored
10
vehicles are
closest
death traps
people
too, because
to
they got.
you.
I'm sorry.
You and the 10 closest people to you.
Yeah, or one or two. I mean, depending on the side of the mine, the size of the mine. But yeah, but the armored vehicles are also death traps too, because the Russians control the skies. So the helicopters and the I guess if the artillery is accurate enough, the drones spot them, and then the artillery just blows them away, or the drones drop bombs on them, or they have suicide drones and that kind of thing. So,
I'm just going to assume though that a mine is more powerful than a grenade, right?
Yes.
So when you throw a grenade,
I don't know exactly, but yeah,
when you throw a
from what I've
grenade,
seen, yeah,
a grenade has about a 5-meter blast radius, right? So I'm assuming that if some dude crawls over a mine, it's going to be more than 5 meters that it's catching that blast radius. And so you're talking several, you're talking almost a dozen people involved in this blast, because you're not spreading out your forces to be like 2 or 3 people per 5 meters. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I know that I've seen footage of Ukrainians getting their legs blown off by these mines.
Right.
And it's, it's enough to blow their legs off to the knee and maybe worse, but doesn't necessarily kill them and wouldn't necessarily kill everybody around them. It's certainly enough that if you step on one, you're crippled for life, maimed for life, probably lose your balls. And
yeah,
I don't know. I've seen some where they lose their feet, try, or, below the knee, and tie a tourniquet around it, which is just, I mean, and anybody can find that footage if you look on Twitter or on Telegram or what have you, I guess. And it's just the ugliest damn war out there, man. And people, I had
a buddy
on a page or something, words on a screen. But these are people being blown to bits, man. The level of suffering and the level of grief, the family members too. Like, you think about how sad you are when your auntie dies of old age or whatever. Think about how somebody blew her up. You know what I mean? Like, that's the level of upset here, man, and hard feelings being ingrained, and just, it's a real tragedy. It's going to be, like Iraq War II. We're going to be feeling this thing for the rest of our lives, man, playing out. For sure.
Was the amount of the and let's say the quality of soldiers being killed on the Ukrainian side, did that lead to the American reserves being sent to Europe? Or do you think that was in the plans all along?
I really don't know what's behind that. I mean, I don't think that the Pentagon is looking to get into a fight with Russia in Ukraine. And Joe Biden, it's true, he's crossed the line a lot of times by saying, oh, we won't give real-time intelligence. Okay, we will. We won't give tanks. Okay, we will. We won't do this. We won't give them HIMARS. Okay, we will. But we're going to put in the 82nd Airborne. I mean, they're in Moldova right now as like a show of force. But for what? To say, stay out of Moldova, right? Stay out of Poland. Don't think you can come to Poland.
I mean,
but they're not sending the 82nd
They're not
Airborne.
going to Poland. They're not going to Moldova. We know that.
Like, well, they're in Moldova now, but I'm just saying they're not fighting there. Oh, the Russians aren't going
there.
The
Russians aren't going there.
And just as well, the Americans aren't coming to Ukraine. And the Germans, now the Poles supposedly are sending like deniable, quote unquote, volunteers to go fight. I don't know the real numbers there.
But I did see a headline the other day. Maybe you can clear this up for me. It talked about the CIA having boots on the ground in Ukraine. Do you know what's going on there?
Yes. So we have the best stories I know about that are the Intercept and the Times. And at the Intercept, it's Ken Klippenstein.
I think it
And
was the Intercept article that popped up on my timeline.
I'm sorry.
I said I think it was the Intercept article that
Oh,
popped up
okay.
on my timeline.
So
Yeah.
this would have been half a year ago. Okay, last fall, the Intercept ran a thing that said we got intelligence agents on the ground there. The New York Times, if I remember right, the New York Times only said that we got special operations forces on the ground, but didn't mention the agency.
Mm.
And then they said that the special operations forces are there just for like protecting personnel, American intelligence, civilians, and so forth. Doing Blackwater's old job, you know, securing the embassy and which is really the Marines' job usually, but securing, you know, VIPs, American VIPs in Kiev, rather than leading forces out there in the field, lasing targets and that kind of thing. But we don't really know that. And once you start sending in advisors, you know that they want to fight.
That's what happened in Iraq, right?
Have some fun, yeah. So
isn't that how Iraq started? It was just a couple of hundred advisors, CIA advisors out there,
well,
you know.
We had some of that in the 90s, but Vietnam, certainly that's the story of Vietnam, was that started with advisors and then it just grew and grew and grew. And those advisors were fighting more and more. They were fighting. And then it's like, geez, once you have thousands of advisors, they're not really advisors anymore, are they? They're really like embedded soldiers. And then once Johnson got in there, he started sending by the hundreds of thousands and just go ahead, send the infantry then. But that is, you know, that is how it started. That's the slippery slope from Vietnam.
And so I see these two stories, like, and I'm looking at them side by side, and I'm thinking about like something like Vietnam or Iraq, something like this getting out of control, where you have the CIA operations boots on the ground in Ukraine, and you're sending the reserves right up into Poland and, like you said, Moldova. And I mean, it's not hard to believe that becomes an offensive.
Yeah, I mean, look, you'd like to believe that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other a lot. We know that Blinken and Lavrov are not negotiating, but I have read that Jake Sullivan has a relationship with whoever it is at the Kremlin. And Sullivan being the national security advisor, and I presume the most powerful man in the White House. I really don't know who's in charge up there, to tell you the truth, dude. If it's the chief of staff, like, we really need a Woodward book to come out right now about, you know, from the very inside of the top levels of the Biden principles of their backbiting and their backstabbing and telling on each other to Woodward the way they always do. So, you know, I'd like to really have that. He's the closest thing we have to a fly on the wall at that level. And it's always, of course, very skewed and terrible and Woodwardian, but still it is what it is. It's worth looking at. And I think my best guess is that Sullivan is the one who calls most of the shots, because after all, Blinken is at the State Department. He's not at the White House, you know. So, and then I did read a thing that said Sullivan is talking to the Russians, and that, you know, presumably they're making very clear that, look, when we do this, it means this, it doesn't mean that, but it does mean this. And so, et cetera, and that they all understand each other very well. Which really sucks, Tommy, that we're even having this conversation at all. We have to say that, like, geez, you know, as long as America and Russia are fighting this horrible proxy war right on Russia's border, and we're pouring in tens of billions of dollars of military aid, where our government can take direct responsibility for killing tens of thousands of Russian soldiers and maiming tens of thousands more, that, like, geez, hope they're talking to each other.
And the amount of civilians, like, we don't even know. We know that, from what I understand, we know that there have been like 100,000 Ukrainian troops killed, and like a tenth of that as far as Russian troops killed. But we don't know how many Ukrainian civilians have been murdered during this.
Well, now, the last time I checked, and that's a good point, man, that I need to look into this again. The last numbers I saw from the UN, it was like 5,000 or 6,000 something. Let me write that down, actually, man. I need to have that like updated. Because, you know, one thing is that Well, two major points to make here, I guess. One of them is that so much of the East was evacuated. People fled to the East and fled to the West to get the hell out of there. And so, and the war has been almost entirely fought in the East of the country.
Mm.
Um, and then what was the second thing I was going to say about that? I don't know. I can't remember. I'm sorry. But at least going back about a year ago, I think the number was about 5 or 6,000 civilians dead then.
Mm.
But I guess, yeah, anyway, that one point, I can't remember what my second point was going to be. But anyway, my first one there is that mostly the civilians aren't around where the fighting is taking place. I think there were some people got caught in Mariupol and some other places, you know, in the earlier days of the war. Mostly civilians have been evacuated. And then as far as the casualties, you know, injuries and deaths on both sides, I just don't know. I know that I hear very high numbers from both sides about the other side that seem mostly implausible to me. Like if you told me each side had lost 100,000, I'd be like, all right, you know, dead. And then, you know, maybe another couple 100,000 wounded, something. I forget what the Discord leak said. I know that from the very beginning of the war,
Wasn't Turkey trying
Ukrainians,
to release numbers? Weren't
I'm
weren't
sorry,
they? Wasn't Turkey involved in releasing some numbers a while
I
back?
forget. I forget, but I know the Ukrainians, they claimed that they had killed 20,000 Russians right away and all this stuff that was just not plausible at all.
Mm.
And from the very beginning of the war, they were putting out these extremely high estimates of Russian casualties that I just dismiss out of hand. I don't know where the good ones are. You know, I've heard people say that the usual ratio of casualties that would normally, like at Bakhmut, would normally the attackers would be so much more, would have such a higher rate of casualties than the defenders. I read people saying that that wasn't true in this case because they had such great counter artillery and drones and so forth that the attackers at Bakhmut, and again, we're talking about the prisoners, the conscripts fighting for the Wagner mercenary force there, that they were actually killing Ukrainians in approximately equal numbers or even more numbers than they were losing even on the offensive against dug in positions there. But I'm sorry, man. I wish I had thought to check. I have it in the book here, in my research, what they had from the Discord leaks, which I think is, you know, probably relatively authoritative. You know, it's some military officers addressing their superior officers and saying, well, sir, this is how many we think have been killed. You know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
not necessarily gospel, but it's presumably not them lying to each other about what they think is happening over there. But
Right.
I
Right.
believe
Right.
it, you know, I think in both cases they had, you know, like mid-range tens of thousands, right? Something like what, 30 or 50,000 dead, and then double or triple that wounded. Something. I'm totally spitballing here. I forget off the Discord leaks, man, but it
That's
was
fine.
it was not as high. It's certainly the Russian casualties were not nearly as high as the Ukrainians and Americans had been saying all along. And I think that the Ukrainian casualties were a bit higher than they had been saying all along, which is probably right. You know, somewhere in the middle is the truth. And they had been downplaying Ukrainian casualties and playing up Russian casualties all along. So to have the Russian numbers revised down and the Ukrainian numbers revised up was probably about right, you know?
Yeah. All right. So I want to back up a little bit because you were talking about the Azov region. You've mentioned Mariupol a couple of times, and
Mm.
it made me think of the Azov battalion,
Yeah.
and which got me thinking about the civil war that was taking place before this offensive to of Russia, and this invasion Russia
Yeah.
conducted took place. A lot of what was happening, from what I understand, and maybe you could correct me on this, was that Zelensky had continuously increased the military presence in Mariupol and had been arming the Azov battalion in order to fight off the, I don't even know what you call them, the Donetsk region that had identified as Russian dissidents. I guess they felt themselves more Russian than Ukraine. They wanted kind of their own autonomous region of the Donbass to be kind of their own little country, their own little area. And part of what I understood at the beginning of this offensive was that part of Putin's entire like strategy was to stop Zelensky from actually bombing these people and actually going after these people. Was any of that accurate? Like, what was going on there with that?
Sure. Well, yes, I mean, it's somewhat accurate. Yes. The part about that being Putin's motivation for intervening in 2022 the way that he did, yes, it's part of it. And so, again, people aren't too familiar. Pull up a map, and honestly, the Crimea should be too far away for you to care about it, right? That's why it's a joke in The Simpsons that Mr. Burns, owes a message to the King of Siam over the results of the war in Crimea, is because this is some crazy 19th century stuff that it's a dispute between Russia and Britain. It had nothing to do with us. You know what I mean? We're fighting over Crimea. It's crazy.
Biden did just say God save the Queen. I'm just throwing that out there.
He's on about.
Beatrix always laughs at that because he he pulled a mic drop in that moment too. He's like, God save the Queen. Bah.
Such a weird guy. I think I read that the excuse was that this was like an inside joke to someone in the crowd who he had been talking to previously, but of course, if no one else gets the joke, then it's just weird.
Yeah, he just looks like a lunatic old man.
And they may just be spinning for him anyway, right?
Right. Yeah.
The original answer was, we don't know what the hell he's doing. The Queen's dead anyway. It's a king now.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Sorry. I just
No, it's okay.
You brought up Britain and it just reminded me of that.
But look, I mean, the whole thing, it's a ludicrous subject. It's okay to be ludicrous about it. Chris Murphy bragging about the coup in 2014 on C-SPAN. He goes, Crimea, it's sort of kind of, he like does his fingers like this. It's sort of kind of like this coastal region down there. Right. So here's the senator who's over there with John McCain standing on the stage with the neo-Nazi leaders of what will become the Azov battalion, helping to do this coup, sponsoring this right-wing putsch to overthrow this elected government. And he doesn't even know that Crimea is a peninsula. He doesn't have a picture in his own mind's eye of what the southern coast of Ukraine looks like at all. And so he just says, Crimea, it's sort of like the little coastal area there. Right. Well, it's this big peninsula that sticks off there, and it's where the Russians have had their Black Sea fleet since 1783. Right. And they, meant to keep it. It's extremely important territory to them. And under the USSR, of course, everybody's answerable to the Kremlin. So it made no difference when Khrushchev in 1954, in order to get support from the Ukrainian Communist Party for his bid to replace Stalin after Stalin had died, had given Crimea to Ukraine. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, it stayed with Ukraine on the deal that, along with a deal that the Russians could keep their naval base there. And they had what's called the Kharkiv Pact, was their deal, where they could stay there. And there was some controversy over it over the years, but essentially the deal had held just fine for 24 years until Barack Obama, for the second time in 10 years, overthrew the government of Ukraine. And then the new government immediately threatened to kick the Russians out of that naval base. And that was when the Russians decided to seize the Crimean Peninsula and re-annex it back into the Russian Federation at that point. So then war broke out in the East. And it is true that these were like Russian agents who led the uprisings in the East and seized the buildings and all of that. However, they were just very few men. But they led uprisings of people of Donetsk. So you could say like it was a Russian plot, but then again, they formed these giant militias and first of all, they seized all these buildings, they had huge protests, seized all these buildings, and then when the government just attacked them, they called it a war on terrorism, an anti-terrorism campaign, and invaded the East. They raised all these militias to fight. And at first, and in fact, a lot of who fought were army defectors who quit Kiev's army and went and joined with the separatists. And they weren't really separatists. People call them that, but they were really fighting for autonomy. They had voted for essentially strong federalism, like America gave Iraq, or, like we supposedly have here, right, with states in the Union, that kind of thing. So they were supposed to have this, what they were fighting for was this level of autonomy, not necessarily independence to leave Ukraine. But what happened was, because so much of the army defected and the people of the East were so ready to go to war, they immediately started winning and started handing the Ukrainian military its ass. And so at that point, the Nazis basically, made up from the Patriot Front was kind of the umbrella political group, but allied with the right sector and Svoboda Party militias, which was C-14 was the militia of Svoboda. They all basically formed up and joined together. This guy, Andriy Belitsky, who's the same guy, you see him quoted all the time saying we have to rid the planet of the Juden-led Untermenschen and all of this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And he was the major founder of the Azov battalion there in the fight for Mariupol. And what happened was they succeeded in driving the pro-Russian forces out of Mariupol in, I'm going to say, April of 2014, April, May. They had a big fight, and the neo-Nazis won and forced fighting on the side of Kiev and forced the Russians out. So this really solidified the power of this new Azov battalion, that this group, which it did have members who were Russian speakers and who were Greeks, because there are a lot of Greek expats that live in Mariupol, and there were, all different people who fought for it, but there are a lot of Nazis too. And, there's so much, and in my new book, it's just absolute overkill of sourcing, explaining just how many, Banderists and Hitler-loving Nazis were part of this Azov battalion, and the war crimes that they're guilty of in fighting in the East and depriving civilian, captive civilian populations of food and water, and tortures and murders and disappearances and all of these things. And then, it was funny, let's say like last fall, maybe end of 22, Brett Baer from Fox News interviewed Zelensky. And he goes, man, what is this we're hearing about this Azov battalion being a bunch of Nazis, loving Hitler and killing Jews and stuff? And Zelensky goes, well, they are what they are. But, at the same time, you should know that we integrated them into our armed forces. And so, they're all right. And he goes, well, what about war crimes? And he's like, well, some of them were convicted. So the ones who had committed war crimes, we held them accountable. So it's all good. But of course, that wasn't true. Like those guys a few of them were prosecuted, but they were all released. Mm-hmm. They were never held accountable for what they had done. But he didn't deny that they were Nazis. He just said, look, what are you going to do? It's a war. Just like good old Evelyn Farkas from the Obama government, who was on the National Security Council in the Obama government. She told Newsweek, she was like, look, man, they need all the help they can get. These people are Nazis. We'll just have to worry about that later. Mm-hmm. Who cares about that? And so that's been the attitude. And it's interesting because between 2014 and 22, there's so many stories about this. In the Post, the Times, the Journal, the BBC, and Channel 4, and De Ziet, and De Welt, and Der Spiegel, and France 24, and Lord knows, the Jerusalem Post, and Haaretz, and Ynet, and all the Israeli media, and of course the Kiev Post, and Ukrainian Pravda, and Radio Free Liberty, Radio Europe, which is America's official government propaganda network in Eastern Europe. All of them covered the absolute national socialism of these dudes, proud descendants of the Galatian SS that fought for Hitler and committed the Holocaust in the Second World War. And, proud, their big, poster boy that they follow is Stepan Bandera, who is the leader of the OUNB, whose men, he was on house arrest, basically under the control of the Nazis, while his men perpetrated the Holocaust in Germany, helped German forces. It's something between 800,000 and 1 million Jews and Poles were murdered in the Holocaust, mostly by the Germans, but also by their sock puppets, their Ukrainian sock puppets in the Second World War. And that's who these guys are. They're the proud descendants of those guys. And there's the Adar Battalion and a couple of others, and of the same kind of ilk. As I mentioned, Right Sector, C-14. I guess they say Right Sector is like kind of faded away. I don't know how true that is. C-14, I forgot what the C is, but the 14 is the 14 words of David Lane's famous slogan about securing a future for white children and all that, which is, cliche of American white supremacist groups. And so that's their deal. But the Americans don't care. Now, anyone to the right of Bernie Sanders in America is a Nazi and deserves to be, banned from social media and forbidden from communicating with any other Americans, and maybe in prison for hate speech one day if they could ever get away with that. And, certainly uninvited from polite politics at all. But then actual, real Hitler-loving Nazis with swastika tattoos on their chest and all of that, they're just fine as long as they're killing Russians. The Americans don't care about that at all. And it's really crazy. And, in the book, as I said, it's overkill because I kind of couldn't quit writing about it. There's section after section after section about, the domestic terrorism campaigns that they wage, doing pogroms against hippies. Against gypsies and hippies, anti-war activists and liberals and gay rights groups and whatever. They go and beat the shit out of them all. And, gypsies, squatting under the bridge, they go and beat them all up and set their tents on fire and all this kind of stuff. And then you have like all the laws where they made it where it's a crime to ever say anything good about the Soviet Union, but then they re-legalized saying nice things about Nazi Germany and saying nice things about Stepan Bandera and all of the, right-wing leaders of the anti-Soviet forces in the war. Mm-hmm. And, of course, completely whitewashing their history, denying they participated in the Holocaust at all and this kind of thing, which just had, there were Jewish groups in Ukraine, in Israel, in Europe, and the United States raising hell about this. So we have, when Zelensky says, hey, you should know we integrated them into our military, he doesn't mean as individuals. He means that the Azov battalion is now part of their military. I mean, imagine the U.S. government, the U.S. Army recruiting the Aryan nations and then having the Aryan Nations Division. Mm-hmm. Where they get to stay the Aryan nation, not even, never mind recruiting people like that in the first place, but we're not talking about breaking them up and putting one guy in each, platoon where he does, where his opinions get washed away in everybody else's activity or whatever, but right. Like giving them their own separate group inside the government, there's nothing like this anywhere in the world. We have actual Nazis as a Army division, at war and backed by the United States of America and all of our Western allies that fought the Nazis in the Second World War. And where we used to back Joe Stalin, the worst commie who ever existed until Mao came later, but the worst commie you could have ever imagined, the guy who had committed the Holodomor against the people of Ukraine in the 1930s. We supported him against the Nazis in the Second World War. Because the Nazis were that bad, was the calculation. Now we'll support actual Nazis against Republican Russia, where they got a red, white, and blue flag and a conservative Christian president who keeps running for election and stuff like that. and it's worth aligning with National Socialists against them. It's crazy, man. It is absolutely, I wonder, there are still a few World War II veterans alive in this country. Like, where are they on this? You know what I mean? It really is nuts. And honestly, you can read a thing in the Jewish Daily Forward from just last week by Lev Golinkin that says, like, hey, before the war, these guys were neo-Nazis. They still are. And this is their war.
Yeah.
Now it's in the Forward. You can look at that. It's on the Forward's website right now. Great piece, by the way. Very thorough piece by Golinkin. He's a great guy.
When you I kind of want to like shift gears a little bit here, because I saw this past week and I was like, well, this is interesting. Did you happen to watch the summit that the Blaze put on, where Tucker Carlson was the
Didn't see some of that. Oh, and you know what? I'm sorry, Tommy, because I didn't really finish your answer there. Let me say that in 2014 and 2015, Germany and France signed a peace deal with Kiev and with Moscow called Minsk I and Minsk II. And they were supposed to end
I wanted to go there. So
right.
Go ahead.
So they never did implement it. And the deal is that Poroshenko and then later Zelensky, they both wanted to implement the deal. They both wanted peace. But the deal was these same radical right-wingers I'm talking about would have just murdered him and said so. And I had the quotes in the book where they go, oh, Zelensky, if he appeases Russia, if he makes this deal with Russia, he'll be hanging from a lamppost on, and I can't, Krymork Street or whatever, how you pronounce it, the main drag in Kiev. We'll hang him from a lamppost. And the New York Times said, hey, this is a credible threat, dude. This isn't like just some jackass in Alabama threatening Joe Biden when we all know he's not getting anywhere near Joe Biden, right? This doesn't mean anything, right? The New York Times is like, oh, this is a credible threat. These are the same guys who overthrew the government last time and they could do it again. And when this guy says, I'll kill you, Zelensky hears that and is concerned about that. Right. He's not saying, oh, don't worry, the Secret Service will wrap that guy up and I don't ever even have to think about that again.
Right.
He's not saying that. He's saying, oh, man, I can't push too hard or these guys are going to cut my head off. And then so Stephen Cohen, who is the great Russia scholar from Princeton, he had said, I think Princeton, he has said that the Americans have to support this guy. They have to help him round up and arrest these neo-Nazi leaders who are threatening his life. They have to give him the support that he needs to implement this deal and face down these radical rightists. But the Americans didn't do that. They just poured in more weapons. So give these guys more weapons. Keep the war going. We don't want peace. We want to keep it going. So, I can't go through the whole litany of the year 2021. It's a whole subsection of the Biden chapter in the book. It's just the year 2021. It's just provocation after provocation. And the Russians played their part too, Lord knows. But the Biden government, they just essentially escalated and escalated, more and more support, more and more training, more and more promises of NATO membership and interoperability of their military forces and all of these things. And then right in the lead up to the war, during all of the hype, the hype started the end of October, very beginning in November. I think the first big Washington Post story was on the 1st of November saying that this is coming. They essentially, the idea was we'll pour in enough weapons, and they said, look, this should be a deterrent. We're carefully calibrating the number of weapons, so it's enough to deter Russia from invading, but not enough to provoke them into invading. And then, this guy, Zach, Zach, the guy at Yahoo News. I'm sorry, he had a great series at the beginning of the war at Yahoo News, all about the CIA training of all of these guys and the preparations for the war for all these years. And he quotes in there CIA officers saying, we told them they're going to cause a war. See, that's how I got him right. Like, this is one of the greatest, money gotcha quotes in the book is, we told you there was going to be a war. They said they were calibrating the war to deter Russia from invading, but we told them, and it is honestly straight out of Austrian economics. It sounds like a lecture at Mises or something, right? Where you have like the controller agent problem, where like one guy gives another guy an order, but the way that it gets implemented is not correct, you know? So like the CIA guy is essentially complaining that
Is it Dorfman?
yes,
Like Dorf?
Dorfman, thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
I should remember that because it's the same name as the guy that used to own Vision Skateboards. Brad Dorfman, Zach Dorfman. Got to get that through my head. Dorfman. Anyway, so you can, it's a whole series there, but you can find the quote from him where the CIA guy's going, see, we told them so. Which that goes to show it right there, dude. That's the CIA guy himself saying we provoked this by pouring in all those weapons. Yeah. And we have, and this is all in the book too. And you can find this. Aaron Motte wrote about this on Twitter probably, you know, a year and a half ago. And you can find this all over with the OSCE. You can look at the OSCE website and they show that in the lead up to the war, right in the days before the war, there was a massive increase of artillery attacks by the Ukrainians against the Russian side. Remember, that I don't know for certain, but like, come on, it sure looked like it was the CIA that tried to overthrow the government of Kazakhstan right in January of 22, right in the lead up to the war. They're going, look, we're trying to get Putin to negotiate, even though he was the one trying to get America to negotiate, and they wouldn't. And then they go and there's, you know, it was a riot broke out over gas prices, but then all of a sudden they were like, well-trained teams of armed men seizing police stations and airports and all of this stuff. Like, what is going on? And I don't know exactly, but it looked like, you know, the Turks running an operation on behalf of the Americans, something like that. You know, I don't know if anybody ever wrote like the definitive account of what happened there, but it sure looked like it was the Americans and their friends screwing around with Russia's friends right there on, you know, Kazakhstan is there, Mexico, man. They're doing that right in the run up to the war over there, Canada, in Ukraine. You know, it's just the chutzpah of the Americans and the way that they operate here is it would be very, very easy to argue without having an exact admission from them. Be very easy to argue. I do. That they deliberately provoked this war, that they did not want to prevent it. They did not want to sit down at a table with Putin and hash it out. You know, the Putin's proposed treaty of December 22, Chas Freeman, who was, you know, a renowned American graybeard diplomat, went to shake hands with Mao Zedong with Richard Nixon 50 years ago, was Nixon's translator over there, was the ambassador to Saudi and all these other things. And Obama almost made him the head of the National Intelligence Council, but the Israel lobby stopped him. But he's a great guy. And I interviewed him and I said, well, you know, this treaty, I guess maybe it was all just full of poison pills and it was just made to be rejected like the Rambouillet Accord, which was, for people not familiar, in 1999, this is how the Clinton government got the war in Serbia started to break off Kosovo, was they offered the Rambouillet Peace Accord, which was obviously made to be an offer that had to be rejected. It was an offer made to be rejected, not accepted. And they admitted that later. They said immediately, you know, that they did it in order to be rejected so they could have an excuse to have a war, you know? So I said that to Chas Freeman. Maybe Putin's treaty here is he's just asking for the sky, right? He wants the moon for free and no more income taxes and everything else, right? Yeah, right. But Chas Freeman goes, no, I mean, this treaty, I'm not saying America had to like line right up and sign at the bottom, but sit down and have a real negotiation over it? Yes. Was this an unreasonable series of demands? No. Was this, you know, a reasonable basis of discussion between professional diplomats? Absolutely. But what Biden do? He refused to sign. He refused to even negotiate over it. He said, look, I'll throw you a bone on missile inspections over the missiles, the anti-missile missiles in Romania and Poland. But then he refused to hold any negotiations about setting up that inspection regime. Wouldn't follow through, didn't mean it. And so, I have to tell you, man, and there are people, it's kind of interesting to me. Like I would have denied that anyone in America's on Russia's side at all, because who gives a damn about Russia? It's just the truth is what matters, right? But I do see some people who really do favor Russia's side and argue that they just had absolutely no choice but to do this. And I reject that. I don't think that that's right. I think like if this is a bar fight, whatever, it's just a metaphor. I don't know. It's a matter of quality, not quantity. So you measure it however you want. But to me, I think the Americans basically had Putin's back to the wall, but not all the way in a corner. But like a guy like that, you expect him to wait till you got him all the way in a corner?
Yeah.
Put his back to the wall, he's going to fight you, dude. And so they knew that.
How far? Yeah, how far
They
can you push a
deliberately
guy like
provoked
that?
it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's
So look,
funny you bring up.
by the way, let me just say one more real quick thing here. I mean, I spent 20 years explaining why Al Qaeda went to war with the United States. I wasn't on the side of bin Laden any part of that time. I was just explaining what was going on there. And this is the same thing as that, man. We're not talking about how do you justify what Russia did. We're talking about how do you explain what they did. And how do you explain what they did was the Americans were helping the Ukrainian government kill ethnic Russians in East Ukraine for 8 years. And it wasn't coming to an end. And when Putin said, damn it, I want satisfaction here, they told them to piss off.
Yeah.
So what do you think's going to happen? You know, and then in fact, they didn't just tell them to piss off. They said, in fact, we reiterate today, Ukraine will be a member of NATO, right? They slapped him in the face. So.
Yeah. It's funny you brought up Kazakhstan because I wasn't even thinking about this angle, but when I think back to Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, what out of the Soviet Union, there were two regions he talked about the most about their the resources of oil and natural gas, and that was Ukraine and Kazakhstan. He talked about it a lot. He talked about having to control Kazakhstan and Ukraine in order to get the Soviets under control, because that's how you control their resources, but was by controlling Ukraine and Kazakhstan. And you look at like this whole Hunter Biden BS with him being involved in these oil companies, these natural gas companies. You're like, it's almost like too coincidental.
Well, look, I mean, it's true and it's bullshit. Like, yes, it's true that that's what Brzezinski thought. And that's what a lot of these imperialists, these American strategists do think. But it's stupid and wrong. I mean, you know, I don't know if you have one handy, but just picture the one in your head and think of where Ukraine is compared to Central Asia. And they talk about how Ukraine is this important pivot to Central Asia.
Yeah.
No, it's really not. You know what I mean? And, you know, it is a question like, you know, if you dominate Ukraine, then you dominate the wheat production of Eastern Europe. That's what you got. And you got, if you dominate Crimea, then you control whether or not Russia has access to the Black Sea, which was another thing Brzezinski says in that book is with Crimea, Russia's an empire. Without it, they're nothing but a minor regional power, you know? So, but the idea that if America could only dominate Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Afghanistan, then we'll control Central Asia, and then we'll have the pivot and we'll control the world island. That's still stupid and wrong. How the hell do you control the world island, meaning Eurasia?
Right.
You don't control Russia or China. And you can hem them in. You can try to like keep them off balance or this or that or whatever. But there's no world government run out of North America if it doesn't control Moscow and Beijing. So what world island are you controlling? You're controlling Kazakhstan? I mean, you're talking about low billions of dollars worth of hydrocarbons flowing around. You know, it's the whole Caspian Basin was always like over assumed in terms of their total production capacity anyway. And all that region is broken up in a bunch of different countries, and we got deals with most. So give or take, Kazakhstan is not everything, you know? So in other words, like this is... most of these geopolitics are a bunch of harebrained crap. You know what I mean? Brzezinski is parroting.
The problem is they've been carrying this harebrained crap into our lives since the 60s, you know, and it's affecting all of us.
Since the Second World War. I mean, and there's this British imperialist named Halford Mackinder, and Brzezinski quotes him in the book. He controls the world island, controls the world, and he controls, Yeah, I forgot exactly. I have the little syllogism in Fool's Errand where like somehow Afghanistan is supposed to be central and important to this. Like you got to be kidding me, dude. Afghanistan, if you're doing any kind of business anywhere around there, you go around Afghanistan. Nobody's going through Afghanistan for any reason at all. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
completely crazy. The whole thing is stupid. The whole idea that somehow the North Americans going to rule Eurasia forever. If only we get, line up this pivot point and that one and all of this is completely nuts. And
It just seems like,
especially,
but it seems like they've been following that blueprint this entire
yeah,
time.
I think that's
Is,
right.
I mean, as crazy as it sounds,
Yeah,
they've
no.
been
Well,
following that blueprint.
there's you're familiar with George Friedman from Stratfor in Austin, sort of the private intelligence firm. They do
Oh,
dirty
yeah.
tricks.
Okay, yeah.
Mostly they do like briefings for big business that can't afford the CIA to come and brief them. So they kind of
Right.
get like low rent CIA, kind of analyst briefings and stuff, I guess. And they do some dirty tricks. They were outed in the WikiLeaks, some WikiLeaks files. Not Jeremy R. Hammond, the libertarian, but Jeremy Hammond, a different Hammond, went to prison for liberating some Stratfor emails that had all kinds of revealing stuff in there. Anyway, their leader is a guy named George Friedman, and he's famous for, you're probably familiar with, he gave the statement to Commerçant at the end, I think in December of 2014. They asked him about the coup in Ukraine in February of that year. And he said, oh, yeah, it was the most blatant coup in world history.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, you mean just the street putsch that morning or like the whole thing? And he goes, oh, the whole thing. I mean, just look who put all the money in it. Who was behind it all? In other words, all the groups. And it was Soros and Omidyar and, of course, the National Endowment for Democracy, Uncle
Yeah,
Sam.
USAID and all those guys were
That's
involved.
right.
Yeah.
So he said, this is just, he's a no nonsense guy. He's not like he's on our side, dude. He's not, but he's just like, whatever, man. What are you gonna tell me that wasn't a coup? It was a coup. All right.
Yeah.
He
was proud of it.
Yeah.
He wasn't warning against it. He was proud of it.
Well, I wouldn't say that as much as he's just explaining it. He's just like doing the news. So like, look, let me tell you what's going on here. So there's a couple of points here about Friedman. So the first one is, he tells the Commerçant interviewer, he goes, look, man, if Russia's getting a little too big and powerful or they're having a good year, whatever, we hit them. China's doing okay. Something's going right. We hit them. Iran succeeds at something. We hit them. No matter what, this is our job. Whatever good happens to you, we hit you to try to hurt you, to try to keep you off balance, to try to keep you guessing. Remember the Rand Corporation study from 2019 is called Extending Russia, meaning overextending Russia, baiting Russia into, right, just like the trick with Afghanistan in the 80s, baiting them into overextension, baiting them into having to overspend on too many commitments in too many places because we're just won't stop effing with them here, and 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 here. That's chapter 1 through 10 of the Rand study, and so he's just explaining that's what we do. We hit you to keep you from ever getting your act together, from doing well, from being able to compete and grow your economy and whatever, which is funny because we're demanding that the whole world abandon socialism and adopt markets. Well, that's going to increase everybody's GDP by a lot, man. And
Right.
then you're going to have to hit them all the time to keep them weak in spite of the fact that you're helping them get rich. Stupid. But anyway, there's another thing by him that's worth watching. It's a speech that he gave that's on YouTube that he gave in, I guess it's 2015. And he talks in there about, here's your search term. You can find, in fact, I think Aaron Mate tweeted about this. I'm sure that when he reads my book, he's going to think I stole all that shit from him. But I found a lot of this myself before I saw him tweet about it. I just hoard all my facts for my book that no one gets to see while I'm writing it. But it's George Friedman, and he's saying the primordial fear of the Americans, and he could say that we inherited from the British, is a German-Russian alliance. Because united together, they would rule the world island and be the most powerful force and would completely exclude us from Eastern Europe and presumably Central Asia. And so no matter what happens, we have to keep the Germans and the Russians from getting along too well. And so, and then I think even in that same speech, he talks about Nord Stream and why we, from the American imperialist point of view, we cannot allow for this Nord Stream to go online and create this deeper economic relationship between Germany and Russia. And remember, Biden made the Germans promise, if Russia invades the Donbass, you guys will cancel the Nord Stream, which they did. Another reason why America had the incentive to provoke that war instead of trying to prevent it, because the Germans were not going to cancel the damn pipeline unless the war came. And then they were like, oh, okay, we'll give in and cancel it now. But so where a normal human being who doesn't have a dog in the fight in terms of like specific billions flowing in or you know, hands on levers of power to control other nations in the region, for example, like Poland or the Baltics or whatever, but just a regular schmo from Earth would say, we want the Germans and the Russians to trade. Hydrocarbons this way, dollar bills that way. That's what we want. And then they go, oh no, that's the Russians enslaving the Germans and making the Germans too dependent on their natural gas. Well, fine, it's the Germans enslaving the Russians to their euros. Right. And making so it's this economic interdependence. That's what we want. That's what Frederick Bastiat talked about when he said, where goods do not cross borders, soldiers will. And we don't want to have to fight over who owns the coal mine. We'll just buy your coal, you know? And same thing here with the natural gas, whatever. Not that I'm saying the Germans are going to invade Russia for their gas, but I'm just saying getting these people economically interdependent as possible is the best counter incentive to violent conflict. And then, but so the Americans are hell-bent on stopping it at any chance, you know? That's what they want to prevent from happening at any cost.
Well, you went right where I was going a while ago whenever I brought up the whole Tucker Carlson questioning these presidential.
Yeah, back to that.
Yeah, well, no, you went exactly where I wanted to go anyway. So did you hear when he asked Nikki Haley, he said, it seems obvious that the United States was involved in bombing the Nord Stream pipeline. Why are no Republicans asking the Biden administration why they bombed or
I did not see that.
Yeah, he got on Nikki Haley's ass about not hammering the Biden administration about being involved in the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. I was she didn't have an answer. She you know they dance around everything. They never answer anything straight up. So, but I was just wondering if you did see that exchange, what you thought about him coming out with that question and actually insinuating that the United States was involved in the Nord Stream bombing of the pipeline, the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline, and the crowd reaction being very intrigued and interested in that question.
Yeah. Well, so I don't know exactly what happened to it. I mean, I interviewed Seymour Hersh. She had the big scoop that said that it was Navy miners that did it, or anti-miners that went down there and did it in a deniable operation. There's numerous reports, you know, that, and it's very fishy reporting too. Even the Post and the Times, they both published this story, and then they both also threw cold water on it too. Gazette ran something about it, whatever, and they say there's this sailboat, the Andromeda, that was used, and these divers went down there. James Bamford did like an open source research story. He thought that it was Ukrainians using robots, that they didn't even send men down there, that they used drones to do it, to plant the explosives. And Scahill has a thing recently at The Intercept where he went palling around with this independent kind of retired engineer from, I think, Norway or Sweden.
I think it was Sweden.
Yeah, from Sweden, who did his own investigation, and the way that, you know, what he seemed to discover, he thought made some of these other explanations more likely than the Hersh one. You know, I really don't know. I think, you know, the Washington Post said, yeah, the Ukrainians did it, but the Americans knew about it, and they knew about it for months beforehand. And so, which is, by the way, an attack by Ukraine on a NATO member state, because that wasn't just Russia's pipeline. It was Germany's pipeline too, you know.
Well, yeah,
So,
that was Tucker's point, was like, hey man, like the United States assisted in a terrorist attack on one of our greatest allies. And that was his whole point, you know?
I mean, dude, even going back to the Trump administration, they're putting sanctions on German and Swiss companies who are laying the pipeline.
Yeah.
It's completely bananas the way they did it. You know, people want to, it's interesting the way people think back on Trump, like, you know, I guess depending on how your feelings are, maybe like looking back on a girlfriend, but only remembering the good stuff that you missed, and blocking out all the fights you had or whatever. We're like,
Right.
you know, this is a guy who, you know, likes to brag and remind us from time to time that he gave far more weapons to Ukraine than that wimp Barack Obama ever did, you know, and he was the one who put all these sanctions on Germany and warned them what a terrible blackmail it was for them to go along with this pipeline. And don't you see the Russians are, you know, tricking you with this. And honestly, you know, Rand Paul actually ran a great article. It was a speech. I think he ran as an article at the new, attack at the American Conservative, saying that, look, you think it's a mystery why his buddy Ted Cruz is leading the charge against the pipeline here? They want to sell liquefied natural gas from Texas companies to Germany, and they want to cut out the Russian competition. It's as simple as that. It's plain old mercantilism, you know. And this is the, you know, in democracy, the squeaky wheel gets to grease and all of that. So it's like, has nothing to do with some high-minded principle or this or that. Certainly for Ted Cruz and his part, this whole section of the war party has this just absolute conflict of interest based on compressing and selling liquefied natural gas at huge markups to the Germans after, you know, shipping it across the sea.
Well, I'm going to say, to be fair to anybody who looks back on the Trump administration with rose-colored glasses, it could be a situation of your current girlfriend is such a fucking psycho that you're just willing to take back what you gave away.
I understand.
But all right. Let's call it an end, man. It's been almost an hour and a half. I don't want to keep you too long. I got to eat, and then I got to run to the store before I go to bed. So plug away anything you got to plug, man, and I'll be getting this up tomorrow, hopefully.
Cool. Well, I mean, first and foremost is I run an institute that hosts this podcast very proudly. We featured Tommy Salmons in year 0 at the Libertarian Institute, an integral part of our team there. And we're really doing good, man. I really created the Institute in 2016 with Will Grigg and Sheldon Richman so that we could beg for money without being ashamed, then looking like bums. Like, geez, especially Will Grigg is like the greatest libertarian who ever lived. And then he's like, geez, guys, think you'd help me like get by? It just was so incongruent and wrong. And I thought, oh, what we need is a legal fiction so we can raise some money for that. And after all, it's Will Grigg, man. There ain't no shame in asking to raise money for Will Grigg, especially when it's like a professional type of a thing, you know? But anyway, Will is now long gone, I'm afraid. Yeah. But Sheldon is still here, and we built up such a great team of guys and gals. Well, especially, you know, one gal, Lori, but we've now brought on Quinn Driggs, our outreach coordinator as well. But we got such a great team of writers and podcasters at the Institute that I am absolutely without shame in shamelessly plugging our Institute and demanding that people support. I mean, I take all that money and I just pay the payroll with it. That's where all of it goes, virtually a little bit of travel expenses here and there. But essentially, every bit of what people donate to the Institute goes to pay the podcasters and the writers to keep it going and to keep doing great stuff. And we just put out the best stuff all the time. I mean, just last week, we published Lori Calhoun's new book, Questioning the COVID Company Line, which is, you know, is a collection of her articles that she wrote for the Institute starting in the summer of 2020 and are just absolutely fantastic, which of course you can stand by every single word of them.
And did we just start the latest fundraiser has just started, right?
That's right. So that's my point, is that we got Sheldon, we got, you know, Cato fired their best foreign policy guy, Ted Carpenter. Now he writes for us. We also got Ted Snyder from antiwar.com that we've brought on, as I mentioned, Quinn Driggs. And then, of course, we have Lori. We've got Jim Bovard, who's the greatest libertarian journalist ever, and a hilarious and wonderful guy. And then, of course, Kyle Anzalone and Connor Freeman and Will Porter holding down all the foreign policy all day. Patrick McFarlane and now Joseph Solis Mullins is doing all this great stuff on China. In fact, we're putting out a book by him on China very soon. And he's also an Austrian economist as well. And just whatever, we got 5 or 6 really great podcasts, and we got a ton of great writers, and just it's a ton to be proud of. And I think, our whole team is just gonna be doing better and better and helping set the agenda for libertarianism into the next generation. And so then the point being that we need money to do it. That's it. That's how our government structures all this. You gotta, when you do something like this, it's basically essentially has to be a 501c3 to get away with it. And so in order to be a nonprofit, tax exempt organization, we don't charge at the door. We take donations. And so, that's it. And you can write it off on your taxes too, especially people who are listening who, run a giant corporation, and your giant corporation needs a charity to donate to, or some of you people who are really successful in gold or oil or Bitcoins or business, who, have it to spare. It costs a bit of payroll every month to keep all of these guys doing the work that they do. But I'm just so proud of everybody. I just think it's great. And so I don't give a damn to say that, please head on over to libertarianinstitute.org/donate and help support and help us wrap up this fund drive sooner than later, so that we can get back to just the business of the business full time here. But, man, I know that if I wasn't the Institute, if I wasn't part of the Institute, but it was just there, that this would be my favorite group in the movement. I mean, this is, to me, the cutting edge, hardcore libertarians, the most knowledgeable people, the most experts on all the best stuff. And, always very principled. And yeah, we got 4 or 5 more books coming this year, including my own. Well, 6, maybe including my own. More next year coming, including we're going to put out a collection of Justin Raimondo's essays, and all kinds of stuff. So, man, Libertarian Institute rules. So please help support it. And that's libertarianinstitute.org/donate.
Hell yeah. And if you want to know anything about foreign policy, go to antiwar.com or the Scott Horton Show. That's where you get all your foreign policy.
Oh, yeah.
All right, brother. Well, I'm going to stop the recording.
Cool. Thank you, Tommy.